Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2021 Connect Conference Day 3, brought to you by Huawei and Cloud and Data Stream partner CBRE. Enjoy the next session.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning at our next session on the Connect Conference 2021. We're really excited about many of the speakers that have been joining us this last week. We've covered a variety of topics looking at infrastructure expansion. We've discussed the digital divide, the skills shortage in Africa, and we've spoken extensively about the developments in the adoption of data and cloud services in Africa. This morning, I'm really privileged to be joined by another phenomenal speaker who's joining us from Brussels and in Europe. Francisco has extensive experience in the sector. He's got more than 25 years advising international firms and government agencies on European and international policy and regulatory matters. In 1999, he participated in the development of the European Commission's policy on the WTO TRIPS and access to patented pharmaceuticals in Africa. Francisco moved back to the private sector and developed the representation of the BSA, or Business Software Alliance, in Brussels, where he managed European regulatory affairs for leading international tech corporations for more than 10 years. As a founding partner of Europa Insights, Francisco supports several organizations bringing together leading European corporations, SMEs, and research institutions, such as IP Europe, the Coalition for R&D and IP-intensive European-driven innovators, and CISPI, the cloud infrastructure providers of Europe. He also advocates for the next European budget, InvestEU, to include financing mechanisms to finance the intellectual property of R&D intensive European startups. And their goal is to make these enterprises more competitive and attractive for growth investors. An extensive bio, very privileged to have you on board. Francisco is a dual Swiss and Spanish citizen. By profession, he's a lawyer with an engineering background. He holds a master's of the University of Geneva in law and of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Technology Management, Materials and Fuel Cells Department. Francisco, quite a CV to be read out. I'm very privileged to spend some time with you this morning. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So just by way of background, Francisco and I's our paths crossed in the beginning of 2021 when the South African government published the Data and Cloud Policy, which was out for review. There was a decision made by our working group that we needed to seek international expertise on the subject. And I reached out to CISPI, as we call it here. I know the pronunciation in Europe is slightly different. Firstly, allow me to thank you, Francisco, for being so willing to support us, for giving up your time, for helping us guide and navigate very complex issues that were happening in South Africa, and bringing some of the lessons learned from a European point of view to South Africa.
Thank you, Juanita. I'd like to thank you and Digital Council Africa for this invitation. I'm very privileged to be with you. I'm here, we gave you a very long CV. I think to make things simple, I'm here as the Secretary General of CISPE or CISPI. It's okay, you can say it both ways. It changes in Europe depending on in which country you are and which language they speak. But so CISPE is an organization of 34 members in 14 European countries, where they have been established and where they have significant data center and infrastructure present. We represent, CISPE stands for Cloud Infrastructure Service Provider in Europe. The organization is open to non-European companies, and we have We have over 100 services, cloud infrastructure services, currently declared under our data protection industry code of conduct, which will be, I think, a central point in our discussion. I think Africa is at the crossroads when it comes to developing its digital economy and its infrastructures. And I'm really privileged to be here with you to share a little bit of our experience, the good and the bad experience that we have had in Europe, and hopefully to help South Africa and other countries in the region to and the government also advise them to leapfrog into more faster and better than we've done in Europe, and possibly avoiding some of the limitations and pitfalls that regulator often encounter when they try to regulate, to make rules for a sector that is complex, that is changing at a fast pace, and which requires very flexible and future-proof regulation. On that point, since we met to discuss really about how Europe is deploying its protection of private personal data, maybe we should focus on that. We can talk of other topics, and I've seen that there is a lot of legislation going on in South Africa, which are very similar to what we see currently in Europe. And now, as we speak, there is about, give or take, about 10 legislations which are directly dealing with data. And most of them, if not all of them, have reference to the cloud and cloud infrastructure. And you can name them. I can name a few. We have one for managing illicit content on networks. We have one for creating a data space, protecting database online. We have one legislation, the Digital Market Act, which deals with the new competition rule that should apply to gatekeepers, the very, very large companies that have a significant kind of too big to fail role. We have security legislation, we have certification, and there's a couple of more coming before the end of the year. So it's unprecedented, and I think there's a bit of that also in South Africa. When it comes to data protection, personal data protection, we also have data, free flow of data, non-personal data. But when it comes to personal data and personal data protection, we have a very comprehensive regulation called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which has been adopted in 2016 and which is being applied very recently across the EU. There's been a lot written about this regulation, and I think the equivalent in South Africa would be the POPIA, if I'm not mistaken, this new proposal. This regulation, when it comes to cloud and the digital sector, is extremely interesting. And one thing which I believe is a good best practices for all governments is in Europe, the regulators, they recognize that there is so much variety in how digital cloud supports our economy, our digital economy, and the real economy, that they cannot, in one single piece of legislation, regulate rules all the ways in which personal data is processed and stored. So what Europe has done, which is really an innovation, they have said, okay, there are too many sectors. Each sectors, whether it's cloud computing, transport, health, the financial sector, each sector have their own business model, and on top of that, they have additional regulatory requirements that apply to them. One horizontal data protection legislation cannot meet all these other requirements and cannot be fit for all the different sectors that I mentioned. So what the regulator, all the European 27 lawmakers and regulators did, they said, okay, we recognize that we cannot rule everything with one legislation. So what we will do, we will ask every sector, the banks, the energy sector, the transport sector, health. We will ask cloud computing. We will ask each of these sectors to, if they are representative of that sector, and the industry and the companies to organize themselves and to propose to the regulator a set of tailor-made rules based on, of course, the law. The rule is in the law and the principle in the regulation and data protection regulation. But you have to tailor this rule to your sector. And what we will do, regulator, we will verify that your rules, how you apply the law in your sector, is actually in conformity with both the spirit and the letter of the horizontal legislation on data protection. And once we have reached that point, it's a negotiation. It took us, CISPE developed its code of conduct. It took us 5 years to get there. So it was a rocky road. But the regulator says once we have agreed with you that the rules you propose are the correct one, that they are in conformity with the law, then we will let you implement this rule in your sector. And the only thing we require is that you set an independent and very thorough monitoring and auditing system of how you apply the law through your codes of conduct. And that we, on top of this auditing system, that we will, as regulator, also, perform checks, audits whenever we see fit. So, after 5 years of very intense engagement with the 27 European regulators, CISPE was the first sectoral organization for cloud infrastructure services to have its code of conduct, data protection code of conduct, based on the law, approved by the regulators. That was the first big milestone, and we got there formally in June of this year. Then, you stop me at any time because I can keep talking for...
No, it's incredibly interesting. I think, like having this dialogue, understanding this journey that you've had, I think that's one of the questions that always people want to understand is, what did this journey look like? And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that it took 5 years, because sometimes there's an expectation that we're going to come together as a working group and we're going to write some stuff, and 6 weeks later we've got a draft document that that is acceptable to everybody, but it's not, because like you say, this is a long journey. I think what's where one can benefit, like you guys were sort of the disruptors. You took the lead in developing something, and countries like South Africa can follow that lead and learn from the lessons and look to what you've done.
Definitely, and I think we can save you a few years. That would be great. we can help you avoid some of the, sometimes neither us nor the regulator didn't know precisely what to do. So we did some, iterative process. Sometimes we had to, walk back and explore another way of doing things, and that's why it took 5 years. But I think we did pioneer a little bit by being the first, and also we had oversight of 3 national authorities. First, the French data protection agency, but then also with the Luxembourg and the Germany. So we had 3 countries looking at what we were doing, how we were proposing to apply the law. That was and then the 27 together finally approving the work product. So that took a time. And the other thing which was very important, almost as equally important, because when a government or the European Union basically delegates the application of the law to an industrial sector, a sector representative, they don't do this lightly, and they shouldn't. And they demand the highest possible level of independence in the way the industry is audited, and the assessment that what they do is consistent with both the code of conduct that they have approved and the law itself. So we had 2 big, let's say, 2 big things. Which one was, develop the specific rule for the cloud infrastructure sector, and the other was something that we created together with the regulators because they were following this creation and this innovation. So the other thing was creating a rock solid auditing mechanism that satisfy the legislator, and it satisfy the legislator that the industry is not, not doing the right thing or not walking the talk or cheating or not applying its own rule. So what we did, we created with the regulator, with them together at the same time, and they validated that. We created a system of monitoring bodies. And monitoring bodies can be any organization which is deemed by the regulator to have the organizational and technical capability to audit these codes of conduct. In our case, it's the Cloud Infrastructure Code of Conduct, and to provide an independent assessment that is valid and recognized by the public authorities. And now, as a result, we have already 2 monitoring bodies that I'm aware of that have been approved, actually 3, and there is a 4th one coming, and I'm going to explain who they are. One is Ernst & Young. That was the first one approved after a validation process by the regulator. The second one is LNE. It's a smaller auditing firm based in France. EY is international. LNE is more French-based. Then we had Bureau Veritas, which they'd also do auditing, I suppose, in South Africa. They're an international firm, and this one is the Italian section of the Bureau Veritas. And there's a 4th, I'm not at liberty to disclose, but it's an international law firm who has a presence all over the world, who is also in the process of being hopefully accredited by the regulators. So I think it's important to say that this monitoring, any organization that meet the requirements of independence and competence can become a monitoring body and monitor our code or other codes. This organization, that's the innovation. This organization can monitor or deemed suited to monitor any industry code of conduct when it comes to data protection. So now we have 3, hopefully 4 more will come. It's creating a new market for this, a new auditing and certification market, which I think they really like. And since every sector, not just the cloud industry sector, but every sector, as I mentioned, energy, healthcare, etc., has and will have their own codes of conduct in Europe, it's a fantastic reservoir of trusted and certified auditors that they can tap into. So this is another innovation which the European regulators sanctioned and which is being developed as it's the only, there is no other example in the world. This is really a very good best practice also for the South African government, rather than to try to regulate all sector, which we believe is not possible, and the European legislator also believes the same. They should consider a similar, your government should consider a similar approach in South Africa and across the region. So this is, I think, the message for today. If you can't regulate everything and every aspect of a very complex and fast evolving digital economy, then you should give a control. You can delegate some of these prerogatives, some of the implementation of the rule to sectors, representative sectors, and ensure that there is a strong, effective, and independent auditing and monitoring. Because at the end of the day, it's not just to apply the law and respect the law, it's to give the user, the person, but also the customer, the assurance that your services are not only in conformity with the law, but that they effectively protect your data, that your data is not misused, that your data is not resold or leaked. So this is really the number one goal for us, is give our give the customer of these pay companies the assurance that when they purchase a service that is labeled and declared under that code, that they are really purchasing something of a high value when it comes to data protection.
Francisca, what sort of flexibility has the code got? We know that this is a dynamic environment, and we expect a lot of changes over the next couple of. What does that process look like? If there's a potential or change that is required to effectively govern the sector. Is it fairly flexible, or is it still a very cumbersome? And what sort of obligation is on CISP to say, we notice a change, we notice a requirement from the market, and we're going to advocate that, or do you rely on the regulators to institute that?
So it's interesting. It's a very interesting question. There is a mechanism which was requested by the regulator, and which interestingly respond. It's the same mechanism that government use to modify a law. It's a very fundamental principle of law. It means that you cannot modify an existing regulation with a lesser regulation. So you need to at least have, if you have a law and you want to modify a law, a decree. If you have a decree, then you have to have at least another decree. So in the case of the CISP Code of Conduct, any changes that CISP and the sector see fit needs to be approved by the regulator. We can propose, and so CISP will be the proponent of this any changes to adapt the code to a new regulation or a new legislation or market requirement. But this change will have to be reviewed and validated by the same regulator who who approved the code. So that's the mechanism. It's built in the governance of CISP, and it's linked to the regulator approval.
Okay, that's very interesting, because I think that's one of the concerns around developing a code of conduct, that there has to be some form of flexibility to adjust with market changes and the dynamics in the market. And I suppose one of the other questions I've gotten, this is I know you and I've spoken about this a lot before, but for the sake of the people watching, what are some of the really hard lessons that was learned, and if you can say, the top 3 things of don't go there, or maybe it's 2 things or 1 thing, just like, what is that, where you got a bit of a punch and you learned from the school of hard knocks?
Okay. It's more than 5 years ago, so I'm trying to find a couple of examples. We did a lot of looking and finding to develop this monitoring body approach. We explored, having the company's auditors as embedded into the code. That was not something that was giving enough guarantees of independence, so we abandoned the idea. We had a lot of back and forth in Europe because of actual regulatory change that took place while we were developing the code. I can give an example which you must be familiar. Is there was a lot of regulatory change and policy debate when the safe harbor agreement with the US was stricken down by our the highest court, the European Court of Justice. And it's still there's still nothing in place. So arguably, a lot of the data transfer between Europe and the US are happening in some form of legal void. So when that happened, a lot of question on data localization appeared, and we did spend we took 6 months of delay just because of that. But it was not that we were making trials and errors. It was because of an external regulatory change, and we were fortunate because the CISPE data protection code of conduct has one feature, which is the following. If you declare as a cloud provider a code service under the code of conduct, or the CISP code of conduct, that service must give the choice to your customer to entirely and exclusively store his or her data on the European soil, in data center in Europe. And because of that feature, in the end, the whole debate on moving data out of Europe to another country, to the US in this case, became sort of a moot issue, because the commitment of the CISP companies in their code is, we give you the choice, customer, to keep everything in Europe. So we took 6 months of delay just because of that, because the regulator came to us and said, hey, hold on, there is this high court decision. How do you implement it into your code? So that was an interesting element. It wasn't our fault. It was it was something external on which we have no control. So this and the creation of the monitoring body were probably the most time-consuming and creative also efforts that we had to deploy.
But that was because it was process-driven, and that were just specific processes that needed to be followed.
We put this requirement to store the data in Europe, but if in Africa, in South Africa, you have sufficient capacity, you could well imagine that this also becomes a requirement. If you have data centers capabilities in Europe, this is a very attractive proposition for your potential customer, to say, if you sign up, when we sign up to this, it gives the customer the assurance that his data is safe and secure. Because security was the third example. We ended up implementing standards, security standards, which are very close to the ISO 27001, 18, all the security and data privacy. And if you look at our code, the annex of the code is a very, very long list of security controls, because there cannot be privacy if there is no security in a service. So in fact, the data protection, the level of data protection is commensurate to the number of security control that you apply to the data and the infrastructure. So this might be the third area where we actually spent a lot of engineer time, lawyer time, to implement in a code these standards, but also do it in a way that companies who are not multinational, who have limited compliance resource, can apply them, and that this, I would say, targeted security requirement are, let's say, not an obstacle for smaller player to offer their own services.
I think that's one of the areas where there's some concern. It's like you're looking at the POPIA Act, and we're looking at the data and cloud policy, and I think the implementation of these policies are critical. But then also how to monitor them and how to ensure that there's compliance, which is really big issues for discussion in South Africa at the moment. And I remember you and I spoke about this at some point, and I said to you, what today, if we look at the failures, or no, that's the wrong word, maybe shortcoming is the better word to use around policies like these, then what is it? And I think you said, it's the ability of small companies, like the small companies are struggling with it because they don't necessarily have the resources to implement it, and they maybe need a little bit more time to come round and to to be helped to implement some of these issues. But Francisco, I really want to thank you for your time today. I see we can keep going for another 2 hours. But thank you, and to everybody at CISP, the board of directors. You guys have done a phenomenal job in Europe, and certainly our eyes are very much on what you're doing and how this is growing. And we are really looking forward to a close collaboration with your organization and to learn from you.
Thank you, Juanita. I am delighted. I will relay and repeat our commitment, CISPE commitment to share the best practices with you and with the government in South Africa if they are interested in listening to the industry best practices. And we commit to engage with you, and if necessary, to bring some of our expert and company representatives to engage with yours and with officials in South Africa. We would be delighted to do it.
Thank you
Whenever
very much.
we travel, of course, because now it's a little bit complicated.
Yes, but I think we're getting there. So the numbers in South Africa are looking really great, and the vaccinations are increasing, and there's a lot of adoption around it. So we're hoping that very soon the travel restrictions will be lifted, and that you can come and visit our beautiful country, and we can show you some of our pleasures.
We will with great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. Have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, we trust you enjoyed the session. Thank you to all our sponsors and partners for helping us bring this event to you. Please click on the next link to join the following session.